and our next guest has written an important new book about a subject I tend to obsess about. The book is entitled, I hate when this happens, the entire title is not coming. It's called Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor. Virginia Eubanks is Associate Professor of Political Science at the State University of New York in Albany, and she joins us now. First of all, Virginia, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Yeah, no, look, I should tell you, first of all, by way of context, that the producers at this show used to have a drinking game where every time I ragged on Uber or another Silicon Valley mega corporation, they would have a drink, but, you know, we couldn't operate at that level of inebriation. So, and I've been writing about it in my own little corner of the world for some time, but this is your book is an important contribution to the conversation about the impact of technology, digital tech on the poor. And I guess I would start with this. There are a million ways this conversation could go, but I guess I would start here. I remember a time when the belief was that breakthroughs in technology were going to be this enormous democratizing force, that everybody would have an equal say, everybody's voice would be heard, everybody would have equal influence in the new digital marketplace of ideas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that I think has remained as an ideology in certain decision-maker circles, especially in corporate decision-making circles, but it's not really true, is it?
So what the book is very much about the uneven map of positive outcomes for the sort of newest high-tech tools that sort of go by, the name integrated database or predictive models or other sort of high-tech tools, particularly the ones we use in public services. So my argument in the book is that we're building a digital poorhouse from these tools, and that it is more evolution than revolution. It's more in keeping with the ways that poverty policy have happened in the past. And that it actually really matters who you are and how much power you have and what community you're part of and how you experience these tools. So I think, the big progress story is a story we really like to tell ourselves, that, history is getting better and better for everyone, that the rising tide is lifting all boats. And one of the things that's different about the way I write Automating Inequality is that I'm really invested in people's concrete day-to-day experience around these tools. And I started from the point of view of the folks who are the targets of some of the most punitive and invasive tools I've seen. And it turns out that their point of view is quite different from folks who have more positive or more neutral experiences with data collection and sharing in their lives.
One of the stories that came up in the last few days made me think of your book, and I wanted to bring it up to you because I felt that maybe it was, in its own way, an illustration of the kind of thing you talk about, even though it came to light after the book was written. And that was a story about the fact that algorithms were tending to match women more with cooking and cleaning, and in terms of automatically linking images of women and citations for women and maybe ads for women with the process of cooking dinners or cleaning the house or being homemakers, housewives. And I felt that maybe this linked to some of the things you're talking about, even though you talked specifically about the poor, which is that algorithms that mine data based on how society behaves today are going to reflect and in some cases amplify the biases or inequalities of that data. It's not that the algorithms are wrong per se, but that they lack the human discrimination and judgment that would allow you to say that may be how society is, but it doesn't reflect our values.
Yeah, so the systems that I talk about in the book are all systems that are used by government in public services. And that's actually really important because one of the conversations I want to help start is about the way that these new tools can be used as mechanisms of social control. So there's a lot of great work out there about the commercial algorithms. I know you've talked to Frank Pasquale. He does terrific work on this. Sophia Noble just published a book yesterday called Algorithms of Oppression, which I just started reading today and is fantastic already. So there's some great work out there on these sort of search terms and other kinds of and banking algorithms and other ways that this stuff comes up. The reason that I look specifically at these algorithms in public services is that they make the issues around them really, really concrete, really fast. So let me just give you an example. One of the tools that I look at is an attempt in the state of Indiana in 2006 to automate all of the eligibility processes for their food stamps, Medicaid, and cash assistance programs. And it basically replaced 1,500 local caseworkers with online forms and regionalized call centers in an attempt to break the personal relationships that sometimes develop between caseworkers and the folks they serve. And the result of that was 1 million benefits denials in the course of the first 3 years of this experiment, which was like a 54% increase from the 3 years before. And all the folks who got rejected were rejected for this sort of catch-all reason called failure to cooperate in establishing eligibility, which basically meant that a mistake had happened somewhere in the application process. And because folks no longer had a personal local caseworker to reach out to, they weren't able to get the help they need to make sure that they got all the benefits that they were entitled to. So this is a case where these systems that we might think of from a professional middle class standpoint as, matching us to better opportunities or lowering barriers to government or commercial services, when they're aimed at poor and working communities, when they're inside policies that are already punitive, it turns into the system for very fast diversion. And that's one of the things that I'm really concerned about.
And I read that section of the book, and as I recall, any terminated call would be an automatic disqualifier, for example. So, I mean, I could imagine a mom having to leave to take care of a baby, or somebody getting a call, or somebody calling from work. I mean, I can imagine the phone gets cut off, whatever. That was an automatic disqualifier, if I recall correctly. So that's a good example. You also talk, if I recall correctly, about prison populations.
No, actually, I don't talk about criminal justice in the book, though I do talk about a tool that is intended to match the unhoused population in Los Angeles County with the most appropriate available housing resource that's available. And I also talk about in Allegheny County, which is where Pittsburgh is. I talk about a system that is a statistical model that's supposed to be able to predict which children might be the victims of abuse or neglect in the future. So those are the three cases. I talk about Indiana, the unhoused population in Los Angeles County, and child welfare in Allegheny County or Pittsburgh.
So what is it that makes these tools policing and punishment instruments, in your view?
Well, I think one of the things that we tend to think about these tools is that they're, because they're based on data and because they're implemented by computers rather than flawed human beings, we have a tendency to think that these tools are objective and neutral, but actually they often have politics baked right into them. So, for example, in Los Angeles, the system that I look at in Los Angeles is called the coordinated entry system. And it's not just happening in Los Angeles, it's happening across the country. It's something that many communities are experimenting with. And there's a lot of great reasons to support this kind of technological intervention. So in Los Angeles, there's 58,000 unhoused people, and 75% of them have no shelter at all. And so the housing crisis in Los Angeles County is really remarkably intense. So it makes sense to want to try to prioritize the most vulnerable people for the most appropriate available housing, which is the intention of that system. My concern about that system is that it is, because of the lack of resources in the county, it's not able to provide resources for everyone who goes through the process of applying for resources through this very invasive survey that's called the VI SPDAT, which is a horrible acronym for the Vulnerability Index and Service Decision Prioritization Assistance Tool. And so folks take this very invasive survey that asks them questions like, have you been trading drugs for sex? Are you having unprotected sex? Are you, is there an open warrant out on you? Have you thought about harming yourself or someone else recently? And these are good questions for trying to figure out how vulnerable someone is to prioritize them for a housing resource. The problem is, if for the folks who don't get resources, they've now volunteered this incredibly personal information about their lives into a system that it's really unclear what happens to that data. So they sign a very complete informed consent document, but it actually takes a second step to find out what then happens to your data. If you ask for a second form, you get information back that that the system actually shares your data with 168 different agencies across Los Angeles County. And in addition, based on federal data standards, the information that gets entered into the county's database is actually available to law enforcement without a warrant, just on the basis of oral requests. So the folks who are unhoused, many of the folks who are unhoused who I've talked to about the system, often feel like they're being asked to trade some of the most personal, private information about their in their lives for just a slightly higher lottery ticket for housing. And they felt deeply uncomfortable doing that, but they didn't feel like they had a lot of options. They felt like they were being asked to trade one of their basic human rights, like their ability to express their story in their own way and their ability to have privacy, for another of their human rights, housing.
Right, and I think it's very important to emphasize there too that their concern about their information being shared with law enforcement is a pretty reasonable one, I would think, given the exposure that unhoused individuals have to law enforcement compared to the population as a whole. I mean, I just think there's a genuine vulnerability there that would accelerate and emphasize their fear. It's fair to say.
Yeah. So let me give you an example. Just in the just a few weeks ago, the LA Times ran a story that they've been doing this coordinated entry in Los Angeles County since 2013. And in the last 3 years, which is about the same time period, arrests of the unhoused have gone up by 30%. And I'm not saying that there's a causal relationship between those two things, but there is reason to believe that creating a kind of moral thermometer that says, you know, only the most vulnerable, needy people are going to get housing, that you create a situation that leaves tens of thousands of people in a situation where they may well end up in the criminal justice system because so many of the day-to-day experiences of being unhoused are officially illegal.
Right, exactly. And I guess I would, maybe we can wrap up with this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's fair to say that the use of these systems is going to accelerate. Chances are, it seems to be on the rise. And now, for example, at the federal level, Social Security has issued a document called Vision 2020 a couple of years ago, saying that they're aspiring towards full automation, digital contact, and that type, phone contact, and online. So the trend line seems to be that there are going to be more and more of these systems, and whether it's for vulnerable populations of the kind you cover or for society as a whole, what should people be aware of and maybe even advocating for when it comes to these systems?
Yeah, so I want to be really clear when I talk about the poor or the poor and working class folks, I'm talking about the majority of Americans, right? So 51% of us will be below the poverty line at some point between the ages of 20 and 64, and a full two-thirds of us will access a means-tested public assistance. So these tools are already affecting a majority of Americans. And so that I think it's really important to understand that. But if you're in that 33%, you think you're never going to come into contact with these tools, I fear that after 50 years of experimenting on poor and working class families, the architects of these systems are now aiming at middle class entitlement programs. So things like Social Security, disability, unemployment, and Medicare. So if you look at the Trump administration's proposed budget, the cuts have gotten most of the attention, and the cuts are really, really important. But one of the things that it says that I think we really need to keep an eye on is that the federal government is looking to save $189 billion in these programs over the next 10 years by reducing improper payments, improving program integrity, and what they mean is by collecting and sharing more data, including buying data from commercial data brokers. And this kind of language could really be just pulled in its entirety from that Indiana 2006 plan that ended up with 1 million benefits denials. And so I think it's really, really crucial to keep our eye on these systems as we find ourselves in a moment where politics are very much about rationalizing austerity, right? That these systems can act to create rationalizations for not caring for each other enough, for not sharing our resources well enough. And I think it really bears keeping a close eye.
Well, I think that's a powerful point on which to end, and unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there. Our guest is Virginia Eubanks. The book is, and I will get the title right this time, Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor. Virginia, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.